The committee will come to order, please. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider the following measures: 2 resolutions establishing a FinTech task force and an artificial intelligence task force. H.R. 1988, the Protect Affordable Mortgages for Veterans. H.R. 2409, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. H.R. 2513, the Corporate Transparency Act of 2019. H.R. 2514, the Coordinating Oversight, Upgrading, and Innovating Technology and Examiner Reform or Counter Act of 2019. H.R. 2515, to amend the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 to amend the definition of whistleblower. And H.R. 2534, the Insider Trading Prohibition Act. The chair notes that amendments that were filed 24 hours in advance of the markup will have priority for considerations. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the measures under consideration today. Today, this committee convenes for a markup of 6 bills and resolutions creating 2 task forces. As I have said before, under my leadership, it's a new day and a new way for this committee. Our slate of bills for this markup includes legislation that will help to crack down on criminals, protect investors and whistleblowers, and benefit small businesses. I'm pleased to say that several of the measures we will consider today have bipartisan support. We will consider a bill by Representatives Maloney and King, the Corporate Transparency Act of 2513, to require corporations and limited liability companies, or LLCs, to disclose their beneficial owners to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, ending criminals' ability to use anonymous shell companies to hide their money and illicit activities. We will also consider a bill by Representatives Cleaver and Stivers, the Counter Act 2514, which closes loopholes in the Bank Secrecy Act, increases penalties for those who break the law, and helps provide financial institutions with new tools to fulfill their obligations under the law. In addition, we will consider a bill by Representative Himes, the Insider Trading Prohibition Act 2534, which creates a clear definition of illegal insider trading under securities laws so that there is a codified, consistent standard for courts and participants in financial markets, and to better protect the hard-earned savings of millions of Americans. We'll also consider a bill by Representatives Green and Heisinger, the Whistleblower Protection Reform Act, H.R. 2515, which expands whistleblower protections by amending Dodd-Frank to clarify that whistleblowers who report misconduct to their employers and not to the SEC also have protections against retaliation under the law. We'll also consider a bill put forth by Representatives Asney and Mooney, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act, H.R. 2409, which would require the SEC to identify unique challenges rural small businesses face in securing capital and to describe the most serious issues that these businesses and their investors face in an annual report to Congress. Finally, we will consider a bill put forth by Representative Scott and Zeldin, the Protect Affordable Mortgages for Veterans Act, H.R. 1988, which would ensure that a group of VA loans which were inadvertently made ineligible for securitization by Ginnie Mae are made eligible, thereby enabling those banks to make additional loans, including to veterans. So I want to thank the members for their work on these bills and look forward to moving the legislation forward. I'm also pleased to announce that the committee will create 2 task forces to sharpen our attention on aspects of the financial services industry that need closer scrutiny. The first task force on financial technology will examine the current legal framework for fintech, how fintech is used in lending and how consumers engage with fintech. The second task force on artificial intelligence, or AI, will examine the impact of automation and machine learning and how companies and consumers can use AI to improve their lives. Both of these task forces will provide our committee with the opportunity to dive deep into these issues and better understand where Congress is needed to ensure fintech and AI serve the best interest of consumers, investors, business, and economy. I now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. McHenry, for his opening statement on these measures.
Well, I thank you. I thank Chairwoman Waters for yielding. I do want to say at the outset, you know, Republicans are largely encouraged by the approach to this markup. We've had more opportunity to engage with the majority, and we will have more bipartisan bills come out of this markup than the previous one, and I think that's positive. It also shows that we're interested in legislating and getting things done. And that, truthfully, that when I said committee Republicans were eager to work with you and interested in working with the new majority, I meant it. So you can see that with the number of bills that we'll have today reported out that will be widely bipartisan. So a few additional things. So we have 2 resolutions on fintech and artificial intelligence with these 2 task forces being created. Both fintech and AI are emerging areas that have a huge potential to positively impact our financial system. And there are certainly risks and opportunities as a part of this, and for us to have these task forces produce a product by the end of the year, I think will be a very good thing for our opportunity to legislate. So I thank you for following through on your commitment to create these this task force in order to look more deeply into this subject matter. I'm also pleased that we begin with 2 bipartisan bills that we'd passed out unanimously last Congress. In particular, the Protect Affordable Mortgages for Veterans Act of 2019 and the Expand Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. So with that, for protecting veterans, H.R. 1988, last year in S. 2155, which was a bipartisan bill we enacted into law, we included a provision to address churning through a new seasoning requirement involving home loans. But the implementation of that provision created a technical issue that this bill is designed to solve. And so I think this is a bill we can support in a bipartisan way. With respect to 2409, we've held several housing hearings over the years on this issue with the issues that plague rural areas, including job opportunities and economic mobility issues. And I think this is a very positive thing, sponsored by Congressman Mooney and Congresswoman Axney, and I think it's a very good bill we should pass. A couple of brief thoughts on whistleblower and insider trading bills. Both are responses to Supreme Court cases. In the whistleblower case, it dealt with digital realty. And in the insider trading case, it dealt with a Newman decision. First, with respect to the whistleblower bill, I think the Supreme Court got it wrong in digital realty, but it highlights a vulnerability for whistleblowers that needs to be addressed. This bill accomplishes that goal clearly. With respect to insider trading, I want to thank the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, for continuing to work with committee Republicans. I believe the most prudent step here we can take before moving this bill to the floor is to get real input from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Chairman Powell, according to the committee calendar, will be in here in a week and a half. I think it's really important to get Chairman Clayton, when you have 2 J's, whatever. But Chairman Clayton coming in next week, we can get further testimony on whether or not this bill, in fact, achieves that result of dealing with the Newman case. There are other cases that are pending that deal with it in the same manner. And so we've got more work to do. Chairwoman Waters and I, the first bill we passed this year was bipartisan, where she was the lead sponsor and I was a co-sponsor, and it dealt with a study on corporate insider trading. We do not yet have the data out of that to ensure that this bill conforms with what is in fact happening in the marketplace. Two final thoughts. One on AML BSA. I think we have a good bipartisan product. I think this is a very good committee product that has been 7 months, 8 months of serious legislating in the making, and we can pass that bill in strong fashion and update our system. On beneficial ownership, the Corporate Transparency Act of 2019, however, has significant challenges in my view. We've heard from NFIB regarding the potential impact on small businesses. Moreover, the fact that we create another government repository and collection of our personal information is no small thing, and we need to deeply contemplate that before we're able to come to terms on whether or not FinCEN should have a new governmental database on the ownership structure of every small business in America. What I need on this and what I've requested from FinCEN is serious data, not simple anecdotes. And so far, I've only gotten anecdotes. So with that, I thank Chairwoman Waters for today's hearing and look forward to making this as expeditious as possible.
Thank you very much. Before we begin the markup, I would like to recognize the ranking member, gentleman from North Carolina, for 5 minutes to discuss a matter of importance to the committee.
Well, and I thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Madam Chair, we both are blessed with having talented staff on both sides of the aisle on this committee, and some are long-serving. And today I recognize Clinton Jones, who has served on among committee Republicans for the last 23 years. Clinton? I didn't do that correctly. I didn't follow the script exactly how I was supposed to. Let me explain. Clinton is leaving committee Republicans after 23 years. And so for those of us that have tried to legislate in a bipartisan way, Clinton has been a real conduit for that. And Chairwoman Waters, I think you will speak to your experience. But I just want to give you a little background after his 23 years here on the committee. Clinton Columbus Jones III, or CC to his friends, was born to Olga Beeman, and Clinton Jones II at a U.S. Army base in Germany. And little did he know that he would embark on a career in public service. He's been a stalwart among Financial Service Committee Republicans and is in fact referred to as the Dean of Financial Service Committee staffers. He's a native of both Kansas and my home state of North Carolina. He first came to Capitol Hill in 1993 after earning an urban planning degree and then a law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Why I'm not overly encouraged by his choice of universities, I am grateful that he is a great native son of North Carolina. During his time on Capitol Hill, Clinton worked under 7 different full committee chairs, 7 Republican housing subcommittee chairs or ranking members, and helped craft some of the most important housing and insurance bills of this generation, including the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998 and the Housing Opportunity through Modernization Act of 2016, as well as the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform and Modernization Act of 2012. In his spare time, when he's not facing the changing housing environment, Clinton is a professor at Howard University teaching pre-law to aspiring lawyers for over the last 20 years. He's an active member and volunteer at his church. He's a world traveler, a lover of biographies and historical fiction, a big fan of the 1986 Atlantic Monthly article on the 20th century northern housing migration, and a dedicated mentor and tutor to his colleagues and peers on the Hill and at his alma mater and in his fraternity. In addition to all the above, he's a single father to a 15-year-old son and talented student who is Clinton Beeman Jones IV. Clinton will be leaving us at the end of the week to take on a new adventure, but he won't be going too far. And hopefully, if this committee gets engaged in housing finance reform, we'll see more of him, and he will be a great advisor for bipartisan outcomes there. But in the meantime, he'll be serving as a senior advisor to the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which, as we know, is just a few blocks away from here on the Hill. While we hate to see him go, we take extreme pride in knowing we were able to borrow his knowledge, his deep talent, his great capacity for members and their oddities, including me as a new member, and his generosity, his kindness to all members is well noted, and also deeply speaks to his character and his real view on how you interact with people even in the midst of most challenging situations. And so, Clinton, I thank you for your work here on the Hill. I thank you for what you've done in terms of public policy, but most of all, I'm grateful to have known you and to learn from you. And so with that, I thank the indulgence of the committee.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
I now would like to recognize myself for 5 minutes on the same matter. I would also like to say some words about Clinton Jones. Clinton has been, of course, with the committee, even though the ranking member said 23, it's actually 24 years. In addition to serving under ranking member McHenry, he served under 4 chairmen, Henserlin, Backus, Oxley, and Leach. He is an expert on housing and insurance issues, but also an advocate for the low-income people who rely on these programs. Clinton may not always agreed with Democrats on policy, but he has been an important voice in guiding committee chairmen over the years on a perspective not frequently heard in their conference. That is the perspective of the least of these and of the impact of policies on people, especially on people of color. Clinton has always been thoughtful in his approach to housing policy issues and has always been kind and fair to this side of the aisle. He is also a proud father to his son, CB, and has raised a smart, strong, fine young man who truly has a role model in his father. And I must depart a moment from my script and tell you I expect him to have him here before he leaves. He's been promising me for years now that he was going to bring him. I haven't seen him for years, and so unless he, brings him in and keeps his promise, we're going to hold him here, and he won't be able to go do his job. Although I will miss Clinton, his wisdom and his thoughtfulness, I appreciate that he's bringing those skills to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, where they are greatly needed. I wish him the best and thank him for his years of service, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you. Thank you. The chair now calls up H.R. 1988, the Protect Affordable Mortgages for Veterans Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1988, a bill to clarify seasoning requirements for certain refinanced mortgage loans and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 1988 is dispensed with. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance and are on the desk. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1988, offered by Mr. David Scott of Georgia. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the protecting of...
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Waters. As has been previously mentioned in the committee, last year we passed the Banking Regulation Bill S-2155, and in there we included bipartisan reforms to refinancing requirements for veterans' home loans to protect our veterans from the predatory practice of what is called loan churning. Now, loan churning is this. That's where the bad actors come in. And we do have bad actors, and let me say we have good actors in the loan business. But in this one, churning is so cruel. It's where these bad actors in the mortgage lending, refinancing loans, they come in and they refinance these loans to our veterans over and over and over again. I can't think of a more abusive and fraudulent manner than this. And we dealt with that in that bill. However, a technical error in the implementation timeline has caused a cohort of 2,500 veterans loans to be ineligible for Ginnie Mae's securitization. And this causes a strain on liquidity, and furthermore, it boxes out these veteran loans from the secondary market opportunities. Our bill, H.R. 1981, is a bipartisan bill that will correct this, and it will preserve critical VA refinancing protection for our veterans, while at the same time allowing for our veterans' loans to be securitized, which means rolled into securities, into investments, into market securities. That is it, plain and simple. And I want to thank my Republican sponsors, Representative Lee Selden and Mike Levine and Andy Barr. And I want to thank Chairwoman Maxine Waters for her leadership in our helping our veterans in this badly needed area. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we owe our veterans, our brave service members, and a great sense of gratitude. Let me just say, for those who may not know, we are losing 20 veterans every single day to suicide. I see this is a crying out for help and for us to focus attention. And it is absolutely essential that we strengthen the veterans' home loan market and preserve safe, affordable, and accessible borrowing opportunities away from deceptive marketing practices, away from fraud and abuse like churning, for our brave and courageous active duty military personnel and our veterans. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there discussion of our amendments to H.R. 1988?
I move to strike the last word. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from North Carolina moves to strike the last word.
Last Congress, we enacted H.R. 2155. This bill cleans up a provision that was in that bill, as Congressman Scott outlines very well, that addresses the dubious practice of churning, especially when it comes to, in particular, when it comes to loans insured by the VA. And it's a question of really refinancing those home loans over and over to generate fees and profits for lenders with a slight short-term benefit to the borrower, but an increased life of the loan cost. Unfortunately, the provision created a technical issue for some VA loans that this bill will now solve. And so, look, this is about helping the veterans and making sure we've got the most technically proficient lending available to them and securitized by Ginnie Mae. And so I encourage committee members to vote for this bill, and with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word for 5 minutes.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
I support this bill and the technical fixes it provides, and congratulate my colleague David Scott and Zeldin and Barr for their bipartisan work on it. And we know that economic growth and regulatory relief and Consumer Protection Act did not intend to orphan these 2,500 impacted loans before pooling them under Ginnie Mae, and I support them being grandfathered into eligibility. I support the language also in this version of the bill that adjusts and clarifies details of the loan seasoning period, thereby reducing administrative complications. Together, these improvements will help strengthen the protections in place for our veterans for VA loan refinancing and remove uncertainty for the 2,500 loans that were negatively impacted. This is an improvement and a movement in the right direction, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan effort to fix this problem, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? Mr. Barr,
Move to strike the last word.
now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And let me first just say, Madam Chairwoman, it was great to welcome you to the Commonwealth of Kentucky over the weekend and join me and my fellow Kentuckians for the Kentucky Derby. I hope you had a great time.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time.
Good. Thank you. And let me thank also my colleagues, Congressman Scott, Congressman Zeldin, and Congressman Levin for their leadership on this important issue. As a member of both this committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee, this is an important correction. It's a technical correction, but an important correction that will benefit our veterans. This is a simple correction to fix an unintended consequence of Section 309 of S-2155, the financial regulatory relief legislation that we passed in the last Congress. And I am sure that this bill will receive the same bipartisan support that it did this morning in the VA committee markup, where Congressman Levin and I worked to advance this bill. Like my colleagues mentioned, this was an unintended consequence. It's just a drafting error of one section of the bill that was included to protect our service members and veterans who are targets of loan churning. This important provision instituted new requirements that ensured that refinancings were always going to be in the benefit of the veteran, not just a source of fee revenue for the lender. These requirements provided that the veteran must be able to recoup their fees paid for the refinancing within 36 months, and that the veteran receive a net tangible benefit from the refinancing. Refinancing should never hurt the veteran, they should help the veteran. And the third requirement intended to address the rate at which these loans were being refinanced. It was a seasoning requirement of 201 days from the first payment made by the veteran that must be met before refinancing was an option. But because of a mismatch in the timing of the passage of the legislation and the implementation of the new rules, there are now currently about 2,500 orphaned loans that are ineligible for Ginnie Mae pooling and securitization. These loans were closed but not yet securitized when S-2155 passed. Therefore, these loans, which were eligible at the time they closed and backed by the VA, are now ineligible for Ginnie Mae securitization. Without this technical correction, these loans will create liquidity strains for some of the lenders who make these VA loans, which could ultimately impact the rates our veterans pay and hinder the ability of these lenders or their willingness to originate similar loans in the future. It's critical to point out that this legislation only addresses the pooling eligibility of these 2,500 orphan loans, and it does nothing to weaken the anti-churning provisions of S-2155. I look forward to moving this legislation forward to provide certainty to veterans who, through no fault of their own, have been left in limbo while protecting the VA mortgage market as a whole from a liquidity crisis. Our veterans have earned the right to access the VA home loan program through their service to our country, and it's incumbent upon the House to ensure that this technical error does not impede their access or increase borrowing costs. Again, let me just compliment and applaud the gentleman from Georgia, my friend Mr. Scott, for his leadership on this issue, and also Mr. Zeldin from New York for his leadership on this issue. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for bringing the bill before the committee today. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize, yes, Mr. Zeldin.
Move to strike the last word.
Is from New York. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your support of this important legislation. It's been a privilege, a pleasure working with my Democratic colleague from Georgia, Mr. Scott. stepping up to the plate for our nation's veterans by reintroducing this bipartisan legislation. Since last year, Congressman Scott and I have been working together on the Protecting Affordable Mortgages for Veterans Act. We had a unanimous vote in this committee last year, as well as a unanimous vote on the floor of the House. This year, we reintroduced this legislation together along with our colleague, Congressman Barr, and Congressman Mike Levin, who serves on the Veterans Affairs Committee. This legislation will provide a technical fix so that home loans issued last year and guaranteed by the Department of Veterans Affairs can remain eligible for the secondary market. It is estimated 2,500 or more VA home loans issued in May and June of last year have now been boxed out of the securitization market due to a legislative error. Through passage of this bill, we can ensure that VA home loans are not adversely impacted by issues in the mortgage market created by the unintended consequences of Senate 2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. Senate Bill 2155 contains some very important bipartisan reforms to protect veterans from predatory lending and deceptive marketing. These provisions of S 2155 are now the law of the land and are protecting the VA home loan market. But confusing timelines laid out in the new law and the way the Government National Mortgage Association, also known as Ginnie Mae, chose to implement the new requirements have left an estimated 2,500 or more VA home loans orphaned. These mortgages are now considered orphaned because they are no longer eligible for Ginnie Mae securitization, even though they met all federal requirements and are backed by the VA. If lenders aren't able to securitize VA home loans, the negative impact will be passed on to our veterans through increased closing costs, higher borrowing costs, and in reduced opportunities to borrow or refinance. It is important to note that the securitization of these loans makes sense for the vets. They benefit because it results in lower rates. Not only for that, but it also makes sense for investors because veterans have some of the lowest default and foreclosure rates in the nation. The brave men and women of our armed forces have earned access to VA home loans through their selfless service to our country. Even one VA home loan negatively impacted by a minor mistake is one too many when it comes to giving our veterans access to home ownership. This fix is essential to prevent a crunch in liquidity for the veteran home loan market and, most importantly, to maintain access to affordable VA mortgages. We must pass this bipartisan bill to avoid any negative impact on the brave men and women who have served our country. They deserve a path to home ownership and to the American dream. I urge adoption of this important bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 1 minute. I want to thank Mr. Scott and Mr. Zeldin for this bipartisan legislation. I believe H.R. 1988 is a reasonable attempt to address what were clearly unintended consequences of previous legislation, and I'm pleased to support the bill. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time. If there's no more discussion of or amendments to H.R. 1898, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of approving the committee's say aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 1988 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 1988 is reported favorably to the House. The chair now calls up H.R. 2409, the Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2409, a bill to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to expand access to capital for rural area, small businesses, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa for 5 minutes to explain the bill.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues here on the committee, in particular Mr. Mooney, Ms. Velasquez, Mr. Riggleman, Mr. Rose, as well as Mr. Pappas, for their work and co-sponsoring on expanding access to capital to Rural Job Creators Act. And I'm thrilled to be able to discuss this during National Small Business Week. As a small business owner myself, I know how difficult it can be to access the capital you need to succeed. Rural entrepreneurs often face unique challenges when it comes to accessing capital, but far too often their voices are left out of the conversation. For example, in a recent Federal Reserve survey of small businesses, despite more than 70% of rural small businesses being a low credit risk, less than half received the full amount of financing that they were seeking. And even that is in the face that rural small businesses tend to be more stable than urban small businesses. What happens here is this restricts growth in rural areas, and that same survey found that only 35% of rural small businesses expected to increase employment in the next year, compared with 51% of urban small businesses. And this can lead to and create a cycle where younger people are leaving our rural areas because there are no jobs, furthering the decline of certain rural areas that I know many of my fellow committee members who have helped sponsor this understand from the districts that they come from. The bipartisan Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act will ensure that rural small businesses have a seat at the table as federal policymakers consider new rules that will govern investment and capital. The Office of the Advocate of Small Business Capital Formation at the SEC was established to promote the interests of small businesses and make sure they have access to capital, with a focus on supporting women and minority-owned businesses. And I'd also like to recognize the work of Ms. Velasquez and others in the last Congress to include small businesses affected by natural disasters like those in the recent flooding in Iowa in my district. My legislation, H.R. 2409, would expand the focus areas of the advocate to include rural area small businesses. This data will help Congress and federal regulators make better informed decisions on how to best support economic growth in rural America. And by ensuring Washington listens to the voices of rural small business owners, this legislation will help create jobs in rural Iowa and across the country. And when rural small business owners have access to capital, they continue to reinvest in their communities. Like Theo and Bonnie Ramsey, who I went and visited this past weekend in Lenox, Iowa, who bought and revitalized a grocery store, and they've now opened up a hardware store and are hoping to also build out a hotel or some type of bed and breakfast and bring folks to their community. And just down the road in Corning, Iowa, believe it or not, we have what's becoming known as a nationally known restaurant called Primrose, because there's a James Beard awarded chef there, and he's helping to drive business and opportunity for that town. Both of these examples show we can keep young people in rural areas, and it benefits our country if we just give them opportunity. And since small businesses are the backbone of the American economy, finding creative ways to grow businesses and economic opportunity will ultimately create jobs. I want to thank the chairwoman and my colleagues for their support in working on this issue, and I ask for a yes vote. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mooney of West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your willingness to have this bipartisan piece of legislation considered during today's markup. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Ms. Axney, for her leadership on this bill and for her advocacy for small businesses. Ms. Axney just spoke very eloquently and cited some very important statistics for the need for this bill, so I won't repeat all of that, but it was great to hear that information given here today. I also want to thank Ms. Velasquez, Mr. Riggleman, Mr. Rose, and Mr. Pappas for their early and unwavering support for this important bill. It is a bill like this that proves we can work together and get things done for our constituents, our communities, and for the greater good of our country. I represent the rural state of West Virginia, and as I tour small businesses and meet with folks across the 17 rural counties that I represent, I hear about the challenges facing rural business owners. Frankly, they often feel the government's not there for them. Their number one concern and a hurdle they face in doing business is the challenge of receiving the financing they need to open their doors in the first place, or just keep their doors open during a tough time they might be going through. The Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act gives these rural businesses, small businesses across the country, an opportunity to be heard and be part of the greater economic conversation and, frankly, the economic boom that's going on today. Since the beginning of this Congress, In the very first meeting of this committee under this 116th Congress, I've called on the full committee and the subcommittees on investor protection, entrepreneurship and capital markets and diversity and inclusion to acknowledge the concerns and disadvantage of rural areas to address the lack of capital being extended to rural small businesses. And I'm pleased that this bill today is a step in the right direction to acknowledge and address the issues that I've raised. We did have this bill in the last Congress. I and former Congressman Reuben Kuhn of Nevada had put this bill in. It passed committee. It got through the House and never was even considered in the Senate, which is unfortunate. Hopefully the U.S. Senate this year will pay attention to this important bill and other important issues that languish over there. But it's important we get it through early here in this 2-year term. And I just want to thank Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry also for making this bill a priority at today's markup. Like Ms. Axney, I ask for a yes vote on this bill, and I hope for unanimous support. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Ms. Maloney.
I move to strike the last word. And first of all, you recognize me? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I first of all want to recognize Cindy Axney, who's a new member to our committee, newly elected. And like so many of our new members of Congress, she's showing extraordinary leadership in responding to the needs of her community and critical issues in this country. So I'm pleased to join her and others in this bipartisan effort and join Mr. Mooney and Nydia Velazquez, Pappas, and others. And I can see why this bill has so much bipartisan support, because it gives us the tools and analysis necessary to make better decisions for capital formation for our small businesses to allow them to expand. I represent one of the most urban districts in the entire country, but I know how important facilitating capital formation is for all areas, especially rural areas. And having the advocate expand their focus to consider the needs of rural communities will make us more informed about the national landscape for small businesses. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I again congratulate Cindy Axney for her extraordinary leadership. I hope that this will be the first bill she passes in Congress, but knowing her, she may have already passed a lot of them. I urge a bipartisan support for this bill.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Small businesses are truly the heart of job growth in rural communities. The vast majority of the 19 counties in Tennessee's 6th district that I represent are rural, with 4 of those counties being characterized as distressed counties. The workforces in these communities depend on the job opportunities provided by entrepreneurs who build their businesses from the ground up. In the last few weeks, I've visited 10 such small businesses in rural communities in Tennessee's 6th district. The men and women who run and work for these rural small businesses are some of the hardest working people who I've ever met. This bill is simple. It includes rural businesses in the mission of the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. This will allow rural small businesses to receive the capital formation technical assistance they might need, and will require the SEC to consider any adverse effects regulations might have on rural small businesses. Rural small businesses are often overlooked, but their capital formation challenges deserve the same attention as any other type of small business. I urge all members of this committee to support this common sense bill, and I thank Ms. Axney for her leadership. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I would like to also thank my colleagues, Representative Axney and Representative Mooney, for introducing this legislation. This bill will expand the mission of the SEC Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation to identify the unique challenges facing rural small businesses. As someone who, with my wife, has started a distillery agribusiness in a rural part of Virginia, in a district that's larger than New Jersey, I can attest firsthand how difficult it can be, but also how rewarding the experience is. According to census data from 2017, 1 in 5 Americans live in a rural area. For my district, the 5th District of Virginia, I have about 65% of the population, more or less, that resides in a rural area. I think these people deserve the same access to the financial system as urban dwellers and urban businesses. This bill will allow the SEC to help job creators and improve rural economies across the country. I look forward to working with the SEC and my colleagues to accomplish this mission. For these reasons and many more, I strongly support this legislation and urge everyone else to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2409? The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I move to strike the last word. Florida, where I'm from, is always considered an urban state. But in the Panhandle area, where I have represented rural areas for many, many years in the state legislature, and now in the 5th Congressional District is represent about 6 of those rural areas where they're constantly trying to expand economic opportunity and growth and economic development in those areas. They are all squished in between 2 major cities. But throughout my career, I've always understood the importance of what rural economic development means because I grew up in a rural area myself. This is a very important bill that I would urge all my colleagues to support. And I can guarantee you that when you take a look at what rural economic development means to our society as a whole, you would clearly understand how important this particular legislation is. I really appreciate the work that my colleague here, they say it's a first termer. I spent some time in Iowa, and so I know what Iowa is like, but it's not so much of that. It is coming with the knowledge that we need to do something to help economic development and help and make sure that we don't overlook rural communities. So with that, Madam Chair, I will be voting for it, and I urge my colleagues to vote for it because it means a whole lot to rural communities in America.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank the author and the sponsors of this bill. This is important to my rural district, the rural parts of my district, and a lot of folks in the major cities don't realize how difficult it is for some of these rural businesses, small businesses to access capital. And so this is very important to the rural portions of my district. And I'm very grateful for your support, and thank you, and I look forward to joining you in supporting this bill. And I appreciate the Madam Chair and Ranking Member McHenry, and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 1 minute. According to a recent survey by the Small Business Majority, roughly 1 in 5 rural small businesses rated access to capital as one of the top 3 challenges to maintaining or growing their businesses in their community. What's more, these businesses largely get their funds from personal savings, and only 13% said they had received investments or gifts from friends or family. So I think it's time for the SEC to look into why that is and see what, if anything, can be done to encourage capital formation in our nation's rural small businesses. This bipartisan bill passed the House by a near unanimous vote last Congress. So I would urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2409? For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to echo the comments that I've heard today and want to recognize and thank the hard work of Mr. Mooney and Ms. Axney on this legislation. Many of us do represent rural America, and many of the challenges, as the chairman was just noting, have a lot of real challenges to be able to maintain those businesses and to be able to create jobs. As we've often noted over the last couple of years in this committee, capitalism doesn't work without capital. And that access to those dollars to be able to grow those communities is critically important for people that are often left out and left behind, even during economic recoveries, as so many of our districts are. So I think that this will be a tool to be able to help open those doors, to be able to help build those businesses, and to be able to create those jobs for our people back at home. I'd urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2409? If not, the question now occurs on ordering H.R. 2409 to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor of approving H.R. 2409 say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 2409 is reported favorably to the House. The chair now calls up H.R. 2534, the Insider Trading Prohibition Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2534, a bill to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to prohibit certain securities trading and related communications by those who possess material non-public information. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Insider Trading Prohibition Act. Section 2, prohibition of insider trading. A, in general, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, 15 U.S. Code 78A et sequitur, is amended by inserting after Section 16 the following new section. Section 16A, prohibition on insider trading. A, prohibition against trading securities while in possession of material, non-public information. It shall be unlawful for any person directly or indirectly to purchase, sell, or enter into, or cause the purchase or sale of, or entry into any security, security-based swap, or security-based swap agreement while in possession of material, non-public information relating to such security, security-based swap, or security-based swap agreement, or relating to the market for such security, security-based swap, or security-based swap agreement, if such person knows or recklessly disregards that such information has been obtained wrongfully, or that such purchase or sale would constitute a wrongful use of such information. B, prohibition against the wrongful communication of certain material, non-public information. It shall be unlawful for any person whose own purchase or sale of a security, security-based swap, or entry into a security-based swap agreement would violate subsection A, referred to in this subsection as the communicating person, wrongfully to communicate material, non-public information relating to such security, security-based swap, or security-based swap agreement, or relating to the market for such security, security-based swap, or security-based swap agreement to any other person if, 1, the other person, A, purchases, sells, or causes the purchase or sale of any security or security-based swap, or enters into or causes the entry into any security-based swap agreement to which such communication relates, or B, communicates the information to another person who makes or causes such a purchase, sale, or entry while in possession of such information, and 2, such a purchase, sale, or entry while in possession of such information is reasonably foreseeable. C, standard and knowledge requirement. 1, standard. For purposes of this section, trading while in possession of material, non-public information under subsection A, or communicating material, non-public information under subsection B is wrongful only if the information has been obtained by, or its communication or use would constitute directly or indirectly. A, theft, bribery, misrepresentation, or espionage through electronic or other means. B, a violation of any federal law protecting computer data or the intellectual property or privacy of computer users. C, conversion, misappropriation, or other unauthorized and deceptive taking of such information. Or D, a breach of any fiduciary duty, a breach of a confidentiality agreement, a breach of contract, or a breach of any other personal or other relationship of trust and confidence. 2, knowledge requirement. it shall not be necessary that the person trading while in possession of such information, as prescribed by subsection A, or making the communication as prescribed by subsection B, knows the specific means by which the information was obtained or communicated, or whether any personal benefit was paid or promised by or to any person in the chain of communication, so long as the person trading while in possession of such information or making the communication, as the case may be, was aware, consciously avoided being aware, or recklessly disregarded that such information was wrongfully obtained or communicated. D, derivative liability. Except as provided in Section 20A, no person shall be liable under this section.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 2534 is finally dispensed with. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance and are on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2534, offered by Mr. Himes of Connecticut.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentleman from Connecticut for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your toleration there. I'm delighted to outline the purpose of this bill. The insider trading bill deals with a problem that we have had for decades in this country, which is that, believe it or not, there is no specific statutory prohibition on insider trading. That is, somebody unfairly making money when they have inside information at the expense of people who do not have that information. Historically, for decades now, insider trading has been charged under fraud provisions, and that has created a problem going back to the definition of fraud in the Dirks case, which I will not get into in detail, but which has had the result of creating decades of court-made law. And not just decades of court-made law, but reversals, particularly in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, specifically in the Newman and Solomon cases, that have allowed bad actors over time to have their convictions overturned, and has created an immense amount of activity, use of resources and use of money, because there is not legal clarity around the relatively simple idea that you should not trade on inside information. The bill that I'm offering today will clear that up. Will do two important things. Number one, it will be very clear that the elected representatives of this country, rather than the unelected judges in this country, are responsible for the law, and that if we are going to punish people, it is clearly set out what that law is and who made that law, the elected representatives, not the judiciary. Secondarily, it will put an end to things like reversals in the Second Circuit and all of the uncertainty that exists around the case law associated with insider trading. Just a moment on process, and then I will seek some guidance from the chair and ranking member. We had a hearing on this bill on April 4th, in which perhaps the country's foremost expert on insider trading, Professor John Coffey, noted that this bill expands liability in ways that should not be controversial. The bill was supported by both representatives of Public Citizen and the North American Security Administrators Association. I should note that the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Tom Quadman, raised some objections, or some concerns, I should say, which I've spent weeks now addressing, and I think we have largely addressed with the Chamber of Commerce, pertaining primarily to making sure that we don't in any way damage the ability of people in corporations to have automatic stock sale plans. I have also, just as a matter of process, as my friends on the other side of the aisle know, worked very, very closely with them to address any objections. The ranking member floated two earlier. One was that he would like to hear from SEC Commissioner Jay Clayton. Since the clock was ticking, I just got off the phone with SEC Chair Jay Clayton, who outlined some technical issues that I believe have been addressed by staff and which I think we can probably work out on the way to the floor. They are highly technical issues that I will not get into. I'll just close by saying that the ranking member also referred to the possibility of a Supreme Court appeal in the Martoma case. The Martoma case, again, coming out of the Second Circuit, sent an individual who was an insider trader to jail for insider trading. There is the potential for an appeal to the Supreme Court. The case has not been granted cert by the Supreme Court. But my point is that a law with this kind of clarity will stop those appeals and those attempts to reverse convictions as a result of the ambiguity of decades' worth of court-established law. So with that, I will pause because I believe the agreement we have reached is that we will proceed with the bill with the understanding, and I offer this to the ranking member, that there will be some technical changes made on the way to the floor. I will continue to be open-minded, and I know that the ranking member has said that he will as well, and if that's consistent with his understanding, I will yield to the ranking member.
Yeah, if the gentleman would yield, I'd like to read my opening statement about the changes we would seek that are still remaining and the concerns I have with the bill. I also would like to have more than 30 seconds to speak to how you've engaged in this process, how Congressman Himes, you've engaged in this legislative process in a very constructive way. And so with that, I'll take 5 minutes for myself, and if we could engage in a colloquy then for a broader understanding.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I think Chairwoman Waters. So let me begin. As I said, we all agree that we need to prevent crackdown, fraud, and abuse within the financial system. Insider trading really harms mom and pop investors. We have, as Congressman Himes said, a number of court cases that are running in conflict with one another. It is an opportunity for Congress to clarify what is a longstanding understanding of what longstanding body of law and court case and precedent on insider trading. Those nuances and those regulations developed over decades, putting that into a single statute is a complicated undertaking. So, Congressman Himes, I commend you for how you've engaged in this process, the work of getting legitimate concerns addressed, and carving out this bill in a way that is not perfect for any party, but good enough for both parties so we can come to an understanding of what is, in fact, insider trading, as defined by those court cases. We have, and so I want to commend you on how you've engaged in that process to come to this point. We have a testimony from former Chair Mary Jo White, who describes the challenges of codifying insider trading. We also have statements from Chair Clayton that are very similar to what Chair White says in those difficulties, and they both have very different views as chairs of the SEC on enforcement matters. So working through that, the issues that we have with this bill right now are that question of personal benefit, which is what Congressman Himes, you are seeking to clarify, and the question of downstream tippees and how they are dealt with. And so those are the issues on Maine that we're trying to deal with. We know that insider trading cases are still ongoing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have standing they have a long body of law in which they continue to act upon. So I do think we have enough time between here and the floor to get those technical questions at play that we discussed here privately, but are mostly in the zone of personal benefit and downstream tippees, and then ensuring that we're actually dealing with those nuances in law. What's been described, the difficulty here is if we write this law, it could be too overly broad in one way and too narrow in another, and we just want to make sure that that is dealt with in an appropriate way. And so, at this point, as you mentioned, before I get to that, you mentioned the Martoma case. The question of whether or not the Supreme Court will grant cert on this case is not certain, and so that is a case in conflict with another case and the resolution that we're trying to come to in law is to resolve some of those differences. And so that was my initial concern with trying to legislate too expeditiously on this matter. But if you're willing, and Congressman Himes, to that effort, I do want to thank you for reaching out to committee Republicans. We all agree that there's no place for insider trading, and I want to work with you to ensure the bill moves to the floor and it accomplishes just that, as I outlined, and to catch those that commit insider trading and to strengthen the penalties for those that commit these offenses. So, before going to the floor, I would ask the bill's author and Chairwoman Waters for their commitment to work with us on those technical matters within the bill to ensure that our concerns are addressed prior to floor consideration. And alternatively, I would ask that there be a robust amendment process of the Rules Committee prior to its consideration as well. But knowing that none of the three of us serve on the Rules Committee, I know that is a bit of a challenge as well. So that's what I would raise with Congressman Himes and would yield to him.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and I very much appreciate your constructive engagement on this, and absolutely, I agree with everything you said. If I disagree with one thing, this is really not a Democratic or Republican thing. This is just a clarity of law thing. We want to make good law, so by all means, we will be more than open to constructive amendments and other mechanisms that get us to an even better bill on the floor, and I thank the Ranking Member and the Chairwoman for her patience.
And with that, I'll be prepared to have the bill go by voice, and we can work through this process between here and the floor.
Thank you very much, and I do support the agreement that both of you have reached. And I'd like to start off by thanking both you and Representative Hines, Mr. Ranking Member, for your continuing discussions and all the efforts that have been put forth and will be put forth to resolve any concerns. I'd like to thank again Representative Hines for seeking to correct a decades-long legislative gap by putting into statute a definition of illegal insider trading. For nearly 80 years, the Securities and Exchange Commission has sought to hold corporate insiders accountable for insider trading through the general statutory anti-fraud provisions and rules it has promulgated thereunder. The result has been a web of court decisions that generally prohibit insiders with a duty of trust and confidence to a corporation from secretly trading on material, non-public corporate information for their own personal gain. These insiders are also generally prohibited from tipping outsiders known as tippees, who then trade on the information themselves, even though they know it was wrongfully obtained. Because there isn't a statutory definition, who is subject to the prohibition is constantly changing. For example, in 2014, an appeals court added an additional requirement that the tippee must not just know that information was wrongly disclosed, but must also know about the specific personal benefit that the insider received. According to Preet Bharara, the former top New York prosecutor against Wall Street criminals, the appeals court's decision, quote, provides a virtual roadmap for savvy hedge fund managers to insulate themselves from tippee liability by knowingly placing themselves at the end of a chain of insider information and avoiding learning details about the sources of obvious, confidential, and improperly disclosed information, quote, unquote. This should not be the case, so I'm pleased that while Representative Hines' bill largely codifies existing case law, it overturns this new controversial requirement. Creating a clear, consistent standard for the SEC, the courts, and market participants to follow. This bill is supported by the Council of Institutional Investors, Public Citizen, and our state securities regulators through the North American Securities Administrators Association. So I urge my colleagues to support this long overdue bill. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to echo the ranking members. Kudos to our colleague from Connecticut and the work that he has done on this. And this is a significant and serious issue that we have all been engaged on. In fact, earlier this year, we passed the chair's bill, the Promoting Transparent Standard for Corporate Insiders Act, 413-3. But I think, as has been expressed, some of the technical changes in the conversations that that we have had with the SEC. The author may feel he has addressed the concerns. What I'm not sure is if there's agreement on the conclusion of what he feels has been addressed. And that is what we're trying to get at, and that is something that needs to happen. And in fact, it was interesting. Just yesterday, the SEC announced a settlement, insider trading charges against a Nevada man for $250,000 for his. He traded illicitly for profits of $250,000, and what we need to do is make sure that under current law, those who are guilty remain guilty, and those who are innocent under current law remain innocent. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the nature, certainly, of how I'm approaching this. And we have thrown out a slightly wider net to get some input at the request of some of the folks that we have talked to. And I too am committing, along with the ranking member, to continue to work with the author to find that resolution and to do so quickly. And as has been noted, Chair Clayton being here before this committee, I certainly intend to use time to ask the chairman specifically about this, and I hope others of my colleagues will as well. So I think with that, Madam Chair, I'm
Will the gentleman yield?
happy to yield.
Just to thank you. Just to thank the ranking member of the subcommittee. I very much appreciate his constructive engagement on this. I am a believer that laws, if possible, should be bipartisan. I believe they're more resilient when they have that attribute. So I really thank him for his engagement, and thank his neighbor, Mr. Duffy, too, who got to deal with bad Jim on the floor earlier. Thank you, Mr. Duffy, for your support and help. And yield back.
Well, we're glad to welcome back the good Jim. But as the bipartisan criticism of the past of Mary Jo White and Chair Clayton has been noted, and I think we need to find a bipartisan way to move forward on that. And having a bill of this breadth and sweeping change based on complicated case law does require some technical dealings with that. So with that, I just again appreciate your work on this, and look forward to working with you over the next bit. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I strongly support this bill, and I want to congratulate my colleague and friend, Mr. Himes, for all of his hard work on it. This is an area that he's put a lot of thought into and worked on for years, and really to echo the words of Heitzinga and others, that this is really something that should be bipartisan. It is tremendously important. And the bill would codify insider trading law for the first time ever, which is sort of unbelievable, because I keep reading in the papers about different insider trading accusations and cases. But really what has happened is that insider trading law has been developed by the courts. It's been developed by a series of court decisions and not by Congress. And Mr. Himes's bill would set out a statutory definition of insider trading and would also reverse the very harmful decision U.S. v. Newman Court from 2014. The Newman decision significantly limited insider trading law and required the SEC to prove not only that someone who was tipped inside information knew that the information was wrongfully disclosed, but also that they knew exactly what personal benefit the insider who leaked the information got in exchange for the leak. This decision, in numerous insider trading convictions being overturned wrongfully, in my opinion. And law enforcement has really asked for a definition that would really lead the way or uniformly address this crime. His bill would reverse this decision and would give the SEC, the Justice Department, the tools they need to police the markets and ensure that they are fair to all investors. And since markets run more on I'd say confidence than any other factor, if we don't have confidence that it's fair, then I believe people will move away from the markets. So I think it's important to the overall economy, quite frankly, and not only to the markets and for transparency. And I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I urge any effort to work with Mr. Himes to make it a bipartisan effort. And I yield back.
Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2534?
Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I just want to also commend my colleague, Congressman Himes, for his work on this bill. It looks like we are moving in a bipartisan way. I think that's good as well. I think I agree that most of our constituents would be shocked to learn that currently there is no congressional law that prohibits the practice of insider training. So this comes as a good time. It's wrong, it's unfair, and plain and simple, it's cheating. So I do applaud Mr. Hines for working to better clarify the statute around this, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2534? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 2534 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor of approving H.R. 2534, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 2534 is reported favorably to the House. The chair now calls up H.R. 2515 to amend the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 to amend the definition of whistleblower. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2515, a bill to amend the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 to amend the definition of whistleblower, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Section 1, whistleblower. Section 21FA6 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 2515 is dispensed with. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance and are on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2515, offered by Mr. Green of Texas. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Whistleblower Protection Reform
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes to explain the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I especially would like to thank you for allowing this piece of legislation to come forward, allowing me to bring it forward. I'd also like to thank you and the ranking member for the bipartisanship that has been displayed. The two of you have demonstrated leadership that we greatly appreciate. With reference to the legislation itself, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors, Mr. Huizinga, Ms. Maloney, Mr. Meeks, Ms. Beatty, and Mr. V. Gonzalez. I thank all of you for your support of this legislation. This legislation is endorsed by Public Citizen, the Government Accountability Project, the Project on Government Oversight, Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, the Public Investors Attribution Bar Association. And while the SEC and the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, they do not take positions on bills, they have reviewed the text and advised that it accomplishes the stated objectives. This bill, Madam Chair, restores the law to its state before the Supreme Court's decision in Digital Realty Trust, Inc. versus Summers. In that case, the court ruled that existing law protects whistleblowers from retaliation only if they report company wrongdoing to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. As a result, any whistleblower today who reports wrongdoing only within their company is not protected from employer retaliation. Dodd-Frank expressly barred retaliation by employers against whistleblowers and gave whistleblowers a private right cause of action if discharged or discriminated against by an employer. Digital Realty vastly curtailed those protections. In fact, under Digital Realty, there is an incentive now for employees who know of corporate wrongdoing to forego internal company channels and instead proceed immediately to the SEC, thereby undermining the efficacy of corporate compliance reporting systems. We believe that it is better to give the employee the opportunity to report within. This legislation will fix, if you will, it will restore the law to the status quo ante as it existed prior to Digital Realty. Again, I thank all of my colleagues for their support, and I would like to insert in the record, by way of unanimous consent, letters of support from SIFMA, the Public Citizen Organization mentioned previously, the Project on Government Oversight, and the Government Accountability Project. Now, having said these things, I'd like to just make a final comment. It is important to have persons who can call wrongdoing to the attention of the appropriate authorities. It's important because obviously we'd like the wrongdoing to be reported and to be dealt with appropriately. But there's another reason. It's important because if we know, if those who are in the business, if they are aware that there is the possibility of a whistleblower looking over the shoulder of the person who's committing the wrongdoing, that in and of itself acts as a deterrent. It is the deterrent impact that we have to greatly appreciate, because this ultimately is what we'd like to see occur. We'd like to see no wrongdoing take place. Knowing that there are whistleblowers capable of reporting the wrongdoing can put us in a position such that we will have less wrongdoing taking place within corporate America. I think this is a good piece of legislation. I'm proud that my friends and my colleagues have supported it. This is bipartisan, and I believe that it will restore the status quo ante such that whistleblowers will have the protection that they richly deserve as they seek to assure us that all is well within corporate America, or else they will let us know. With this said, Madam Chair, I kindly yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Madam
The
Chair.
gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to congratulate and thank my colleague, Mr. Green, for working with me and others on this important bill. And this bipartisan bill has been carefully crafted to clarify the application of the anti-retaliation provisions that were provided within Dodd-Frank Act. And look, I believe we all know that whistleblowers are an effective means of rooting out bad behavior that harms the market as well as investors, and that internal reporting may be more efficient and practical in some cases as employers have a chance to correct, self-report, or take other action. What we're trying to do here today is to make sure that those internal reports are not able to be used against a whistleblower. And Section 922 of the Dodd-Frank amended Securities and Exchange Act of 34 to afford these whistleblowers protection from retaliation by their employers but it also allowed the SEC to provide monetary awards to whistleblowers who provide original information resulting in monetary sanctions over $1 million. But as was pointed out in February of 2018 in the Digital Reality versus Summers case, whistleblowers that report alleged misconduct internally to their employer as opposed to the SEC are not protected by Dodd-Frank's anti-retaliation provisions. That clearly needs to be rectified, and by further clarifying this anti-retaliation provisions that they apply only that apply to those whistleblowers who report internally, I believe it will actually encourage employees to report potential misconduct instead of automatically escalating the issue to the SEC. Moreover, by clarifying the application of the Dodd-Frank Act, anti-retaliation protections to internal whistleblowers, the bill aligns with similar protections for internal whistleblowers within the Whistleblower Protection Act and Sarbanes-Oxley as well. So, again, to my colleague, congratulations on this important work. Thank you for your work on that. I'm looking forward to continuing to work on this, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd also like to, without objection, insert a letter of support from SIFMA into the record.
Without objection, such is the order.
I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It is also my honor not only to be a co-sponsor of this bill, but to thank my colleague, Congressman Green, who is also the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation, for his work. This is a much-needed piece of legislation, and I'm proud that he is amending Section 922 of the Dodd-Frank Act so the right protections are provided for those who report alleged misconduct to their employees. Thank you, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion or amendments on the bill? I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I thank Chairman Green for crafting this timely piece of legislation to ensure that all whistleblowers of suspected securities law violations are protected from retaliation by their employers. In the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress provided the Securities and Exchange Commission the authority to reward whistleblowers that voluntarily provide the SEC with original information that leads to a successful enforcement action with monetary sanctions exceeding $1 million. Realizing that these whistleblowers may be deterred by their employers, Congress also required the SEC to issue regulations to protect them from retaliatory efforts, such as firing or demotion. But the Supreme Court in 2018 held that whistleblowers who report alleged misconduct internally, but not to the SEC, are not protected by the anti-retaliation provisions of Dodd-Frank. This is not what Congress intended. Indeed, requiring whistleblowers to race to the SEC in order to be protected discourages them from reporting their suspicions to their superiors. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce highlighted the importance of internal reporting in its 2010 letter to the SEC, stating, quote, "The experience of the many companies with robust internal reporting programs, as well as the empirical evidence, demonstrate that all stakeholders benefit when those with knowledge of potential securities law violations report internally, thus enabling management to promptly investigate and take remedial action," quote unquote. By clarifying that whistleblowers who only report alleged misconduct to their employers are also protected by the anti-retaliation provisions in Dodd-Frank, this bill would encourage employees to communicate potential securities law violations to their employers without fear of being fired before they're able to report to the SEC. Again, I thank Chairman Green for pushing this important bill and urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it.
Madam Chair.
Is there further discussion of our amendments to
Madam
H.R.
Chair.
2515? For what
Madam-
purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'd like to extend this 5 minutes to Mr. Green.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate this, Mr. Scott. Madam Chair, I promise to be very brief, but it would be inappropriate for me not to thank the staff that has worked on this. The staff on both sides of the aisle worked tirelessly to make this happen, and I too often have made the mistake of thanking everyone except the staff. So again, I'd like to thank Mr. Heisinger, Ms. Maloney, Mr. Meeks, Ms. Beatty, Mr. Gonzalez, and I also would like to thank you and my staff and your staff, committee staff, for the extremely efficient and effective job that they have done to bring this to fruition. With this, I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 2515? If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of approving, say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 2515 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 2515 as amended is reported favorably to the House. The chair now stands in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow.